A wild Mustang stallion, trapped and desperate, approaches a rural farmhouse in the dead of night. His behavior was so unusual that witnesses couldn't believe their eyes. When a gruff, solitary rancher discovers the horse's urgent plea, he makes a decision that defies all logic and expectation. This incredible true story of communication across species will challenge everything you thought you knew about wild horses and the human capacity for compassion. The full moon illuminated the Nevada desert landscape as Robert Allison, a 58-year-old rancher with weathered skin and graying temples, was awakened by a sound he couldn't immediately identify. Living alone for the past decade since his wife's passing and 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, unusual night noises always warranted investigation. Grabbing his shotgun and flashlight, Robert stepped onto his porch. What he saw made him freeze mid-step. A wild horse stood in his yard, not 50 feet from the house. Even in the moonlight, Robert could see it was a Mustang stallion, its lean frame and alert posture unmistakable. As a third-generation cattle rancher, Robert knew the wild horse herds that roamed the public lands surrounding his property. He'd always maintained a respectful distance, viewing them as magnificent but separate from the human world. In 30 years of ranching, he had never seen a wild Mustang approach a human dwelling voluntarily. Yet here one stood, pawing at the ground and making soft nickering sounds. Unlike anything Robert had heard before, the stallion took several steps toward the porch, then retreated, only to approach again. "What in the world?" Robert muttered, lowering his gun. The horse, a striking dun with primitive markings and a black mane, repeated this approach-retreat pattern 3 times. Then, most surprisingly, it turned and took several steps away before looking back at Robert expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" Robert said aloud, feeling foolish for talking to a wild animal. As if in answer, the stallion whinnied sharply, then took a few more steps before turning to look at Robert again. Robert had heard stories about horses seeking human help, but those were domesticated animals with human imprinting. Wild Mustangs typically fled at the mere scent of humans. This behavior defied everything he knew about wild horses. With a sigh, Robert went inside to exchange his slippers for boots and grab a jacket. "Martha would say I've finally lost my mind," he said to the empty house, thinking of his late wife. The stallion waited, tense but stationary, as Robert descended the porch steps. When the rancher approached within 20 feet, the horse moved off, maintaining that distance, but clearly leading him away from the house. Robert followed cautiously. The Mustang led him across his property toward the boundary where his land met public grazing territory. In the moonlight, the stallion's movements appeared urgent and purposeful. After nearly half a mile, the horse stopped at a barbed wire fence that marked the property line. Here, Robert noticed the stallion was limping slightly, favoring his right foreleg. But what caught his attention more was the horse's behavior. He paced along the fence line, looking back toward the public land beyond, then returning his gaze to Robert. What are you trying to show me?" Robert wondered aloud, playing his flashlight beam along the fence. That's when he heard it, a soft, distressed whinny coming from beyond the fence line. Robert directed his light toward the sound and felt his heart sink. There, tangled in fallen barbed wire from an old fence repair, was a young Mustang foal struggling weakly against the wire cutting into its legs. The stallion nickered softly, looking from Robert to the foal. The message couldn't have been clearer if he had spoken in English. "Help." Robert assessed the situation quickly. The foal, a buckskin filly no more than a few months old, had become severely entangled in old barbed wire partially buried in the tall grass. Each struggle drove the rusted barbs deeper into her flesh from the disturbed earth around her. She'd been trapped for hours at least, maybe longer. The stallion paced nervously, alternating between watching Robert and approaching the foal with gentle nudges of encouragement. In 20 years of ranching, Robert had never seen behavior like this from a wild horse, especially not a stallion, which typically had little to do with foals that weren't their direct offspring. "Easy there," Robert said softly, approaching the fence. "I need to get some tools." The filly's eyes rolled white with fear as he drew closer. The stallion surprisingly moved between them, not in a threatening way, but almost as if communicating. To the foal that this human was necessary, if frightening, help, Robert hurried back to his house. Gathering wire cutters, thick gloves, a first aid kit, and a blanket, as he rushed back, he wondered what had transpired to create this unlikely scenario. Had the stallion somehow understood that human intervention was the foal's only hope? Or was this simply my desperate instinct driving unusual behavior? When he returned, the scene was unchanged, the foal still trapped, weakening by the minute, and the stallion still standing guard, watchful but allowing Robert's approach. I need to cross onto public land, Robert muttered to himself. Technically, he wasn't supposed to interfere with wild horses without authorization. Bureau of Land Management regulations were strict and designed to protect the Mustangs from harassment, but this was clearly a life-or-death emergency. Robert climbed carefully through his fence and approached the trapped foal. The stallion backed away, maintaining a watchful distance of about 15 feet, close enough to monitor, but far enough to allow work. Up close, the situation was worse than Robert had initially assessed. The barbed wire had wrapped around 3 of the filly's legs, with multiple puncture wounds visible. Blood had soaked into the dirt beneath her. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, her eyes glazed with pain and fear. "You're in a real fix, little one," Robert said gently. He spread the blanket on the ground and began the delicate process of cutting away the wire. Without causing further injury, each time the wire cutter snipped, the foal flinched, but she was too weak to struggle much. The stallion watched intently, occasionally nickering softly as if offering reassurance. It took nearly an hour of painstaking work to free the filly from the wire. When the last strand fell away, she made no attempt to rise, too exhausted and injured to stand. In the beam of his flashlight, Robert could see multiple deep lacerations, some alarmingly close to major blood vessels. "You need more help then. I can give you here," Robert told the foal, stroking her neck cautiously. To his surprise, she didn't pull away from his touch. The question now was what to do next. The filly needed veterinary care immediately, but the nearest equine vet was in Carson City, over 2 hours away. Moving a wild, injured foal would be challenging, even with proper equipment, which he didn't have. Robert looked up at the stallion, who had drawn closer now that the immediate task was complete. Their eyes met in what felt like a moment of mutual understanding. "I'll need to take her to my barn," Robert said, as if the wild horse could comprehend. "She won't make it out here." What happened next would challenge everything Robert thought he knew about wild Mustangs. As dawn broke over the Nevada desert, Robert found himself in a situation he could never have imagined. In his barn, lying on fresh straw, was a wild Mustang foal. More incredibly, standing in the open doorway, neither entering fully nor leaving, was the stallion who had led him to her after freeing the filly from the wire. Robert had fashioned a makeshift travois from fence poles and a tarp to drag her the half-mile back to his property. Throughout that difficult journey, the stallion had followed at a consistent distance, nickering softly whenever the foal made sounds of distress. Now, as Robert cleaned the filly's wounds with antiseptic, the stallion remained, watching with an intensity that seemed to transcend normal animal awareness. Robert had left the barn door open, expecting the wild horse to flee once the foal was relatively safe. Instead, he had maintained his vigil through the remaining hours of darkness. "You're breaking all the rules of wild horse behavior," Robert told the stallion as he worked. "You know that, right?" By phone, the veterinarian in Carson City had given him instructions for emergency treatment until she could arrive later that morning. The filly's wounds were serious, but miraculously had missed major arteries and tendons. With proper care, she had a good chance of recovery. Robert carefully bandaged the worst lacerations, speaking softly to the foal throughout. "You're a lucky little lady. Another few hours out there, and we'd be having a different conversation." As morning light strengthened, Robert got his first clear look at the stallion. He was a classic dun Mustang with primitive markings, a black dorsal stripe running from mane to tail, zebra striping on his legs, and a black face mask around intelligent eyes. Most notably, he bore a distinct scar across his right shoulder, likely from an old injury. Robert estimated him to be about 10 years old, in his prime as a wild stallion. You must be from the Palmer Basin herd, Robert mused. That particular band of Mustangs ranged about 15 miles north of his property. A long way from home. Aren't you? The filly, now that he could see her clearly, was indeed a buckskin with a flaxen mane and tail, perhaps for 5 months old. She was old enough to be weaned, but still highly dependent on the herd for protection. How she had become separated and then tangled in the wire remained a mystery. Robert's phone rang. The veterinarian, Dr. Abigail Chen, was calling with an update. I can be there in about an hour, Robert. How's the fool doing? Stable for now. Responsive. Good pulse. The bleeding has mostly stopped. And you said this is a wild Mustang foal. How did you manage to get her into your barn? Robert hesitated, knowing how unlikely his story would sound. That's the strangest part. A stallion, wild as they come, led me to her. He's still here, watching from the doorway. The silence on the other end spoke volumes. A wild stallion. Dr. Chen finally repeated, led you to an injured foal and is now just hanging around your barn. I know how it sounds, Abigail. You'll see when you get here. After ending the call, Robert stepped outside to give the stallion space, expecting him to take the opportunity to leave. Instead, the Mustang moved to maintain visual contact with the foal. Watching through the open door from a new angle, Robert shook his head in amazement. In 30 years of ranching in Mustang country, he'd never witnessed or even heard of behavior like this. Wild horses, particularly stallions, were supposed to flee from humans, not seek them out. They certainly didn't stand guard outside barns containing injured foals. As he prepared for the vet's arrival, Robert couldn't help wondering what chain of events had led to this extraordinary situation and what would happen when the filly recovered enough to be released. Little did he know, this unusual dawn was just the beginning of a story that would challenge everything wildlife experts thought they knew about Mustang behavior. Dr. Abigail Chen's truck kicked up dust as it approached Robert's ranch. At 42, with 15 years of large animal veterinary experience, she thought she'd seen everything. But the scene that greeted her as she pulled up to the barn made her question that assumption. Just as Robert had described, a wild Mustang stallion stood near the barn entrance when her truck approached. He retreated to a distance of about 50 yards, far enough for safety, but close enough to keep the barn in view. I thought you were exaggerating, she said as she climbed out, medical kit in hand. Robert shook his head. Been there all night. Won't leave. Won't come all the way in. Just keep watch, inside. Abigail found the injured foal lying on clean straw. Her professional demeanor briefly gave way to compassion as she knelt beside the young horse. Poor baby, let's get you fixed up. Her examination was thorough and efficient. The foal had multiple puncture wounds and lacerations from the barbed wire, significant blood loss, and was severely dehydrated. But miraculously, no bones were broken, and the deepest wounds had missed vital structures by millimeters. She's one lucky filly, Abigail said as she administered fluids and antibiotics. Another few hours out there, or if that wire had been half an inch deeper in a couple of places. What about the stallion's behavior? Robert asked. Have you ever seen anything like it? Abigail glanced toward the barn door, where the dun Mustang was still visible in the distance. Never. It contradicts everything we understand about wild horse behavior, especially stallions. She administered a sedative to keep the foal calm during treatment. As the young horse's eyes grew heavy, the stallion outside nickered softly, as if sensing the change. Is he her sire? Abigail wondered aloud. Robert shrugged. Possibly. But stallions don't typically take this much interest in foals, even their own. That's more the mare's domain, as they work together to suture the worst wounds. Abigail explained the recovery process. She'll need at least 3 weeks of care before those lacerations heal enough for her to be mobile. The real question is what happens then. The what happens then was complicated. As a wild Mustang, the filly technically fell under Bureau of Land Management jurisdiction. The protocol would typically require transferring her to a BLM holding facility once stabilized. I'll need to report this, Abigail said, but then she paused, looking thoughtful. I know the local BLM wildlife manager. Let me talk to her first. Explain the situation. Robert nodded, relieved. The standard BLM facilities, while necessary for population management, were often overcrowded and institutional. After what this foal had been through, that environment seemed particularly harsh. And what about him? Robert nodded toward the stallion, who had maintained his vigilant position throughout their work. That's the real mystery, Abigail admitted. By all normal wild horse behavior, he should have returned to his herd by now. A stallion separated too long risks losing his mares to another male. As they finished treating the foal, Abigail took photographs and detailed notes for her report. I'll be back tomorrow to check on her. Keep her quiet, continue the antibiotics as I showed you, and call immediately if her condition changes. Before leaving, Abigail walked to the edge of the barn, studying the stallion with professional curiosity. I've worked with Mustangs for 15 years, and I've never seen one behave like this. It's almost as if he understands she needs human intervention to survive. Robert watched the stallion, who returned his gaze steadily. I think he does understand somehow. He knew exactly what he was doing when he came to get me. As Abigail drove away, Robert was left wondering what the coming days would bring. The foal needed extensive care. The stallion showed no signs of leaving, and soon, the BLM would be involved with its own protocols and regulations. One thing was becoming increasingly clear. This wasn't just a case of an injured horse being treated. Something extraordinary was happening on his small Nevada ranch, something that might change how people understood these wild animals. Days turned into a week as the filly, whom Robert had started calling Willow, began recovering from her ordeal. Each morning and evening, he changed her bandages, administered antibiotics, and monitored her progress. Dr. Chen visited every 3 days, expressing increasing optimism about the foal's chances for a full recovery. Most remarkably, the stallion remained. Robert had begun calling him Sentinel for his unwavering vigilance. The wild horse had established a pattern. During daylight hours, he grazed within sight of the barn, occasionally disappearing over a nearby ridge for an hour or two, presumably to find water. At night, he returned to stand watch near the barn door, sometimes dozing, but never fully relaxing his guard. I talked to Melissa at the BLM, Dr. Chen told Robert during her latest visit. She's fascinated by what's happening here. Instead of transferring the foal to a facility, she's approved to monitor the situation as a special case study. Meaning, Robert asked. Meaning Willow can stay here for her recovery. And they're sending a wildlife behaviorist to observe the stallion. This kind of behavior could change our understanding of wild horse social structures. By the 10th day, Willow had improved enough to stand briefly. Robert had fashioned a sling to help support her weight while her strength returned. The first time she stood successfully, Sentinel had whinnied from outside, as if in encouragement. What happened on the 12th day, however, truly astonished both Robert and Dr. Chen. As they worked with Willow on her daily physical therapy, Sentinel did something unprecedented. He cautiously entered the barn. Don't make any sudden movements, Abigail whispered as the wild stallion took hesitant steps inside, ears flicking nervously. Robert remained perfectly still as Sentinel approached Willow. The stallion gently nuzzled the foal, then, to their utter amazement, turned and extended his muzzle toward Robert, not touching, but close enough that Robert could feel the horse's warm breath on his hand. I think he's thanking you, Abigail said softly, her scientific skepticism momentarily suspended by what she was witnessing. After that breakthrough, Sentinel began spending more time inside the barn, especially during the cooler evenings. Sentinel maintained a cautious distance from humans, but showed increasing comfort with Robert's presence. As he continued to care for Willow, the arrival of Dr. Marcus Wright, a behaviorist assigned by the BLM, marked a new chapter in this unfolding story. After his first day of observation, Dr. Wright was candid in his astonishment. In 20 years studying wild horses, I've never seen anything close to this level of trust from an untamed stallion. He said, he's consciously overriding his natural flight instincts. That kind of decision-making, in a wild Mustang, is extraordinary, and it's clearly rooted in his bond with the foal. As Willow's health steadily improved, questions about her future loomed larger. Standard BLM procedure called for her transfer to a holding facility, where she'd await potential adoption. But the depth of her bond with Sentinel complicated matters in ways no protocol had anticipated. If we separate them after all this, Robert argued during a meeting with BLM officials, we're ignoring everything this situation is teaching us about wild horse social structures. Everyone at the table knew this case was unlike anything they had encountered before, uncharted territory. While the experts debated possible outcomes, Robert remained dedicated to his routine, caring for Willow, with Sentinel never far away. One evening, Robert sat quietly on a hay bale, watching the two horses interact. He realized just how deeply their presence had affected him. What began as an emergency rescue had grown into something profoundly meaningful. It filled a silent corner of his life, offering a sense of purpose that went far beyond the daily grind of managing his struggling ranch. The real question now wasn't just about where Willow would go, it was about what this experience meant for all of them. By the fourth week, Willow's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. The deep lacerations had healed into healthy pink scars. Her energy returned, and she moved about the small corral Robert had built beside the barn with newfound strength and grace. Her buckskin coat gleamed, a sign of good nutrition and diligent care. Sentinel remained ever present. By day, he grazed nearby. By night, he stood watch. Most remarkably, he had formed a cautious yet consistent rapport with Robert. It wasn't trust in the traditional sense, but a quiet tolerance that let Robert approach within a few feet before Sentinel would calmly step back. With Willow's recovery nearly complete, the time had come to make a decision. Dr. Wright and BLM Regional Manager Melissa Thompson returned for what they termed a release assessment. She's fully recovered, Dr. Chen confirmed following a final examination. She's physically ready to return to the wild. The group gathered around Robert's kitchen table to weigh the options. According to protocol, Willow should be transferred to a BLM facility, but Sentinel's continued loyalty complicated the picture. I've reviewed all the documentation and consulted with national experts, Melissa began. Given the unprecedented nature of this case, we're prepared to try a conditional direct release. The plan was both unconventional and bold. Open the corral gate and let Willow decide. If Sentinel led her back to a wild herd, nature would dictate the outcome. But if the two remained near the ranch, an alternative management approach would be considered. It's not standard procedure, Melissa admitted, but nothing about this case has been standard from the beginning. The next morning, with cameras set up to capture every moment for documentation, Robert unlatched and removed the corral gate. Willow stepped forward cautiously, nostrils flaring as she breathed in her first real taste of freedom in over a month. Sentinel stood 30 yards away, motionless but watchful. He made no move to approach. Now we wait, Dr. Wright said softly, as the observers backed away to give Willow space. For nearly 2 hours, Willow tested her boundaries. She ventured a few yards out, only to retreat again, uncertain. Sentinel stayed rooted to his spot as if giving her the autonomy to choose her next step. Then, in a quiet but powerful moment, Willow trotted fully out of the corral and crossed the space to Sentinel. The stallion nuzzled her gently, then turned to look back at Robert with the same piercing gaze that had marked their very first encounter. He's waiting for something, Robert murmured. As if in reply, Sentinel pawed the ground once, then turned and walked away, Willow following closely behind. But instead of heading north toward the Palmer Basin and the presumed location of his herd, Sentinel led her east, toward the lower meadows on Robert's own property. The two horses stopped at the boundary of the ranch, Sentinel casting one final glance back. They're leaving, Dr. Chen said quietly, a note of melancholy in her voice. Robert wasn't convinced. There had been something in that last look, something deliberate and unfinished. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something new. He kept that thought to himself as the officials packed up their gear and concluded the case study. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the Nevada hills, Robert sat alone on his porch, letting the silence settle around him. Then, movement on the distant ridge caught his eye. Two silhouettes stood against the golden sky, a powerful stallion and a smaller figure beside him. "Well, I'll be damned," Robert whispered. They hadn't left after all. They had simply redrawn the map of their world, expanding it just enough to include his ranch at its edge. 1 year later, Robert Allison's ranch had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. What began with a midnight cry for help from a desperate stallion had evolved into a groundbreaking wildlife study one that was quietly rewriting the way scientists understood wild horse behavior. The Bureau of Land Management had designated the eastern edge of Robert's land, along with adjacent public acreage, as a special research zone. Trail cameras now captured the rhythms of what had become known as Sentinel's Band, a small group of Mustangs that included a strong, thriving yearling named Willow and, surprisingly, 3 mares who had joined the stallion from other herds. It's rewriting everything we thought we knew about wild horse social structures, Dr. Wright explained during one of his monthly research visits. Sentinel not only formed a bond with a human during a crisis, but has maintained a home range that keeps his band within view of the ranch. That suggests a level of cognitive reasoning we've never documented in Mustangs before. For Robert, the transformation had been deeply personal. The isolation that once defined his life had given way to regular visits from researchers, students, and photographers, all drawn to the unique relationship between man and wild horse. A modest but steady income from research grants and photography permits had stabilized his finances. Even more profoundly, the presence of Sentinel's band had become a kind of anchor, reminding Robert that he was no longer a lone dot at the meadow edge where his land met the wild expanse of public territory. Sentinel and his band regularly grazed within view of the house. Though they remained untamed, the stallion often approached the fence when Robert appeared, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. "It's not domestication," Robert told a documentary filmmaker. "It's mutual recognition. They're still wild. They've just chosen to include human space in their world." Willow, now nearly grown, bore no fear of the man who had once saved her life. On some days, she would approach the fence and take an apple from Robert's outstretched hand before dancing away, to rejoin the band, a living bridge between wild and tame, between instinct and choice. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on science itself. Sentinel's unprecedented actions, from seeking human help to maintaining a cross-species connection, had ignited a wave of new research into equine cognition. Universities across the country were re-examining long-held assumptions about the intelligence and emotional depth of wild horses. "We've always known they were intelligent," Dr. Chen remarked during a follow-up visit, "but this suggests a kind of emotional intelligence, a decision-making capacity that goes far beyond what we've allowed ourselves to believe." One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Nevada ridge, Sentinel appeared alone at the edge of the meadow. He moved closer than ever before, stopping just 20 yards from the house. For several quiet minutes, stallion and man regarded each other, a silent exchange of understanding that no scientific paper could fully explain. It wasn't submission or dominance, not ownership or possession, just recognition. A connection that had begun in crisis had grown into something sacred, a shared respect between two beings from different worlds. As darkness fell and Sentinel turned to return to his band, Robert remained on the porch, watching. He reflected on how a single midnight encounter had rippled outward, changing not only his own life, but also expanding the world's understanding of the emotional lives of the wild creatures with whom we share this earth. The wild horses remained wild, just as they should, but the boundary between their world and his had shifted, forever redrawn by a stallion who, in a moment of need, understood that some walls are meant to be crossed in the name of compassion. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We share inspiring animal stories every week that just might change how you see the world. Leave a comment below and tell us what part moved you most.